Reaching and Teaching Students in Poverty by Paul C. Gorski. Taylorann, Benthal, Sidney Chiarito, and Lezza, Merrill. The first chapter discusses definitions that Gorski feels are important to the reader. The first definition is socioeconomic status, which refers to a student's or family's access to economic resources. The second definition is poverty, and this is defined as a financial condition in which an individual or family cannot afford the basic human necessities. Now, the author does not believe in the idea that education in America is equal for everyone, and because those in poverty will be the least likely to get out of poverty. This is due to low-income students being placed in the least funded schools with the largest class size and the most inexperienced teachers. Students in poverty are also more likely to be bullied than students not in poverty or with money, and their schools tend to have fewer after-school programs due to being underfunded. These are just a majority of the factors that prevent students from getting out of poverty with an unfair education, all of which are out of their control. Overall, Gorski feels that poverty is a result of everything else that has gone on in someone's life, not their education, and believes that people should try to use the word poor less often. Gorski has also tried and suggests to the reader to become more cultural by stop saying mom, dad, parents, and words of that sort and start saying caretakers, guardians, and things along those lines, to be more aware of the students who may only have one parent, their parents are divorced, their parents are passed away, they're living with a grandparent, etc. On top of that, Chapter 1 also talks about conceptual shifts, such as grit and structural view, but these were covered more in Chapter 4.
The second chapter discusses equity literacy. While this topic is touched on in Chapter 10, Chapter 2 looks at the definitions and breakdowns of where equity literacy comes from. Equity literacy was created by the author, Paul Gorski, to create a set of skills and information to broaden the definition and understanding of cultural competence and diversity awareness. These skills were created to focus on positive ways we can help our students rather than focusing on the negative causes for bias like gender, race, sexuality, access, and opportunity. For equity literacy, there are 4 abilities one must have. The first is recognize. You must be able to recognize even the subtlest biases and inequities within and towards students. Second, you must be able to respond to these biases and inequities. Responding is having the ability to intervene in a positive manner to help the students. Third is redress. What this means is that you are turning the tables on biases and advocating for students who face these biases on a daily basis. Lastly is create and sustain. You must create a bias-free classroom and keep it that way to the best of your ability. Furthermore, Gorski also provides us with 12 principles for educators in order to follow and help understand our families in poverty. The first is that people experiencing poverty are the experts of their own experiences. Second, the right to equitable education opportunity is universal.
Chapter 3 had a large amount of information regarding poverty, wealth, and economic inequality. Some inequalities that stood out in the chapter were that there are about 31 million children in the U.S. living in poverty. Of those 31 million children, almost half of them are living with a single mother, and those single mothers are thought of as a welfare queen and always wanting handouts or living off of the government in regards to food stamps and state insurance, Medicaid, etc. Single mothers tend to get the brunt end of being impoverished because of this term, which was coined by Ronald Reagan. This makes people think that all single mothers want handouts and that they don't want to work to make their lives better when this is not the case. People tend to forget that single mothers are a single parent and that they work most of the time they work 1, 2, or even 3 jobs to make money and feed their families. Society views single mothers in poverty as failures because of how successful other people in our country have become as not single parents. Examples of unequal distribution of poverty start off by focusing on their race, gender, and sexuality, and these all affect how much money a person makes. Now, we already discussed that single mothers get the brunt end of the stick in regards to inequality and poverty. But we can take that one step further and say not just single mothers, but all women tend to have more of an unequal distribution, as many of us know that it's already proven that women only make 80 cents for every dollar that men make. This resulting in them already having less of an income to live off of, which gives more of an insight as to why there are so many single mothers living in poverty. It makes it difficult for them to earn a decent wage, and just women in general, and ensure that they don't become homeless. Now, on top of that, 20% of the wealthiest people in the United States control about 89% of the wealth, and a majority of those being men, as men make $1 for every 80 cents women make. In addition to that, when we look into the sexuality of people, it has been found that people that are transgender face the likelihood of being rejected a job because of their sexuality. So they are also creating a large portion of our homeless population. Gorski also noted that after the recession in 2011, there were more jobs for men, whereas the jobs for the women were gotten rid of. So this also feeds into that that gender inequality that we discussed earlier in regards to the 80 cents for every dollar a man makes. Race, though, comes into account because it has been proven that people of color also have a higher homeless rate than white men due to drug-related crimes and just their skin color preventing people to give them a job to earn money or allow them to live in certain areas in towns and neighborhoods. When discussing homelessness in the textbook, Gorski found that 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, all of those things, because their parents kicked them out of the house when they did finally come out to their parents. These are all just important factors that Gorski wanted the reader to be aware of to understand why people that are in poverty are most likely in poverty, and what teachers and educators can be aware of to look for and prevent happening in their classrooms. There are two important ideas in the education world that Chapter 4 focuses on, and those are called deficit and structural ideology. Deficit ideology is defined as poverty itself is a symptom of ethical, dispositional, and even spiritual deficiencies in the individuals and communities experiencing it. The author then goes on to state that people who support deficit ideology believe that the reason someone is poor and not doing well in school is because the parents do not care and they have taught their child to not care. The book then goes on to talk about how the parents of these children do not value education and they are unmotivated. Deficit ideology goes back to the concept that everything is about hard work when this is not always the case. Deficit ideology can hurt students because it is not a realistic idea of addressing problems that we have in our world, especially our education world. It acts like education is fair for students when those without money tend to come out on the bottom. Now, structural ideology is defined as recognizing people experiencing poverty as targets rather than causes of these unjust conditions. Now, this refers to as there being hope for students because the people with the structural ideology has this mindset among teachers where they think that they can help students rather than blame students for what's going wrong in their lives. Structural ideology acknowledges the fact that parents have to work during hours when students are home, and they have to work 2-3 jobs to provide food for their families. So teachers with the structural ideology acknowledges that it's not always a student's fault that they don't have the background knowledge that they need to succeed, or that they didn't get to do their homework because they had no adult around to help them. Educators with the structural ideology tries not to hold these little things against children, especially because it's not in their control. Instead, teachers teach families the value of education. And structural ideology is recognizing that maybe a parent isn't coming to conference night or academic night because they don't have access to a car. They need to work in the evenings to provide for their family. They don't have access to childcare and so many other reasons. It is important for teachers to acknowledge that structural ideology is when we start to see change in our schools, our students, and our families, whereas deficit ideology hinders it because it just keeps creating and placing blame. Deficit ideology has a very negative effect on students, whereas structural ideology does not, and it creates hope for students.
Chapter 5 discusses the different stereotypes and diversity. The book does discuss that there are more than one stereotypes by touching on gender, race, and sexuality. but the main focus here is poverty due to the large amount of families in poverty in our school systems. These stereotypes are placed on not just the students, but the family as a whole. When we look at the stereotypes poverty-stricken families face, there are 5 typical stereotypes that they see on a daily basis. The most common is that there is no value in education. Poverty-stricken families are considered to have no value in education due to the poor performance and poor opportunities. The second is that they are lazy, that they do not care about their education or succeeding in life. The third To continue, Chapter 6 discusses inequalities outside of the school. People living in poverty tend to face 10 major barriers of inequalities outside of the school, ranging from living wages to cognitive enrichment. When we look at living wages, this means that the job does not make enough money, and from one job they cannot support themselves or their family. Next, we have healthcare. People living in poverty tend to be without or have inadequate care and cannot obtain the medication or health preventative services that others not living in poverty have access to. Third is food. They either have no money for food, or the little they have can only afford junk food and fast food. As for housing, their housing is considered to be unstable. Since most cannot afford to support themselves or their family, they tend to be living with family members or they're out on the streets. Next is work environments. Their work environments, since they are not working living wage jobs, tend to be dangerous and unfair as they are skilled laborers. After we
Chapter 7 talks about the difference between an achievement gap and an opportunity gap. Now, achievement gaps are thought of as a lack of knowledge that a student has, but they are really created from opportunity gaps because the lack of knowledge is due to family wealth. This refers to as when families with money and that are considered wealthy are able to go out on vacations and they can explore their areas around them. They have a lot of family to interact with and they are able to expand their vocabulary, their knowledge, and just their background knowledge and experiences, thus setting them ahead than students that are considered in poverty because they don't have the money to go and explore. They don't have the money to go on vacations to historical landmarks, and they don't have the opportunity to go to the library or own books every day just because they can't get there. They don't have the money to purchase books. Some examples of achievement gaps versus opportunity gaps are when we think of the Scholastic Aptitude Test, also known as the SAT. Now, this is a very common test that 11th and 12th graders need to take in order to move on to college. And you would assume that it is meant to measure how smart a student is after their many years in school. But all the SAT test is doing is measuring how much money a child grew up with and what kind of experiences they were able to have. A child with less resources will most likely do poorer on a test such as the SAT because they did not have the same opportunities growing up. More examples of opportunity gaps are preschools. This is a big one because, as stated before in the book, we already know that children, the achievement gap starts when they are in preschool. Their lack of knowledge starts if they cannot have a good foundation and a good base. Now, parents that are considered in poverty, they cannot afford to enroll students in private preschools, where it's been proven that private preschools tend to be more effective than Head Start programs or VPKs in public schools. And we've also found that preschools such as Head Start or state-funded programs have been proven to be ineffective due to lack of training, lack of funding, and many other reasons. Lack of money, and this lack of money can create that opportunity gap even more, because when a child officially starts kindergarten, they've now fallen behind in their letters, sounds, numbers, learning how to write their name, hold a pencil, tie their shoe, interact with other students, and so on. When poverty-stricken students start at state-mandated schools, such as kindergarten, these schools have a record for being underfunded. Lower-funded schools also lack more services, such as they have less nurses or school counselors as a result of the lack of underfunding. This is a big thing in opportunity gaps. So not only are preschools most likely underfunded, but any Title I school is more or less underfunded because it's a Title I school and they have to go through a lot more hoops to get their money, to get support, fundraising, etc. The fewer the mental health services, the more likely students are to continue to grow up with these troubled lives and not be able to learn because they're going through so many things at home with parents, families, outside of school, inside of school, etc. These jobs that help students, such as school nurses and school counselors, tend to be a budget cut, but they are necessary in helping students grow, and also technology and resources such as centers, small groups, whole groups, whiteboards, smart boards, computers, iPads, those all tend to get cut as well, thus creating an even bigger opportunity gap. Whereas if they had these resources, like the wealthier schools, the more successful schools in school districts, those students could probably succeed just as much as these students can, if not more.
Chapter 8 talks about students who actually experience poverty. As teachers, we need strategies to cope with our families who do come from poverty and to better understand these students. We really have to focus on the students' literacy and their literacy enjoyment. We need to teach them critical thinking skills they need in school as well as in the real world. We also need to teach our students about different cultures and what poverty really means. When we are teaching our curriculum too, the easiest way to keep our poverty students focused is to keep the curriculum relevant and relatable to our students. As well as making our curriculum engaging, we need to keep the students up and moving, making sure their mind is also engaged throughout the school day. I teach at Lewis Anna Woodbury Elementary in Fort Meade. This school is primarily a high poverty school with about 87% of our students living in poverty, which includes our school in the Title I program. Factors that you'll find in our community are a lot of migrant workers. Most of our students end up having to relocate every season to follow the crops. That means they could be in our school for a couple months, or they could be in our school up to 6 months and then have to relocate someplace else. I've had a couple students in the past who have been with me for 6 months and then they'll move to New York for 6 months and then they'll move back. So the students really struggle with the learning differences between Florida and New York. Another major thing about our students is in Fort Meade, we don't have any major businesses. The only major businesses we have are Home Depot and the Dollar Tree. The rest of our businesses are owned by families who have lived in Fort Meade for over 20 years. Another contribution you'll find to the area is that we have way more people than there are actual jobs. So most people have to go to Frostproof, Winter Haven, or Bartow in order to find a job, which makes it hard for most of our families. Another thing, going back to the migrant workers, is 90% of Fort Meade is still crops as well as different farming areas. So most of our students either come from a farming background where maybe one parent is literate or neither parent is literate, and sometimes that makes it hard for our kids who are learning English to grasp it even all the way up to about 12th grade. In Chapter 9, the book talks about the relationships we need to build as teachers with our students and their families. Not all of our families are the same. Not all come from the same background, socioeconomic status, or even religion. We have to make sure we fully understand the background of each of our students so that we as teachers can accommodate to each student's needs. Some schools offer parent nights where the parents can come see their students' work that they have been doing, as well as get to know the school better. We really need to push with our parents the need for them to be involved in our schools and with their students' education.
Back in Chapter 2, we discussed the causes and definitions of equity literacy. Here in Chapter 10, we focus on the professional development opportunities and ways to train educational staff so they can become equity literate. As you can see, there are 3 main ways staff can become equity literate. The first is to build professional development opportunities around the knowledge and skills of equity literacy. What this means is that we will train and we will learn the skills mentioned in Chapter 2.
In Chapter 11, the book talks about the initiatives teachers can take for promoting educational change and societal change. As teachers, we know that our students can struggle, especially in the early grades, if they do not attend preschool. This is something we can push for in our schools and in the families where the kids do not get to go to preschool. We are trying to make sure that we have smaller class sizes and opportunities for our students to grow. We can provide opportunities like extended health services and screenings, encouraging physical fitness, and providing art programs and libraries. Also in Chapter 11, we know that our students who come from poverty not only struggle in school, but out of school as well. We can advocate for living wages of the families and help the families find housing and tenant rights for the students who are homeless or in high poverty areas. Most, if not all, students in high poverty areas usually struggle to find health care that fits the needs of their families and struggle with environmental justice.